Good evening, welcome to This Week in Turkey. Istanbul's mayoral candidates have agreed to take part in a televised debate this Sunday ahead of the June 23rd redo mayoral vote. The face-off between Binali Yıldırım of the ruling Justice and Development Party, AKP, and Ekrem İmamoğlu of the Republican People's Party, CHP, will be screened by all television stations across the country and will be a first in 17 years. Social psychology professor Nebi Sümer from Sabancı University gave a short interview to Medyascope this week on televised debates and how they influence voter preferences.
First time in 17 years in Turkish political history, and live debate between two candidates will occur in 16th of June for Istanbul mayoral election. I think this is very critical given the fact that the Turkish society is extremely polarized in a political spectrum. And the first time the founders and the followers of the opposite parties will be exposed to each other, I think that will be having very positive impact in terms of the democratic culture and the political negotiation and history in Turkey. I think this will be one of the major impact of the debate, given the fact that the polls in Turkey extremely fragmented and have almost no communication between these two groups. So first time they will see each other as non-threatening partners. But I don't think it will have a major effect in terms of the voting behavior of the followers, given the fact that the voting behaviors have been already crystallized and everyone has decided about who to vote. But especially for those undecisive and especially those who do not have extremely committed or identified with the political party might be influenced by this debate. At the end, it may not influence the result of the election, but it will definitely contribute to the culture of democracy in Turkey for future.
First up in the studio this week, we have Murat Utku, who has been following and reporting live from campaign rallies for Medyascope TV since before the March 31st elections. Yep. Actually, welcome once again. Murat will be talking about how the candidates are doing on the ground in rallies in the run-up to June 23rd, the much-awaited rerun mayoral vote in Istanbul. So, welcome once again, Murat.
Thanks.
You've been going around talking to people on the streets of Istanbul in different districts and neighborhoods, and you've been to the two most pro-AKP neighborhoods in Istanbul, meaning they had the highest amount of votes for AKP's candidate Binali Yıldırım. And these neighborhoods were the Akfırat neighborhood in the district of Tuzla on the Anatolian side and the Malkoçoğlu neighborhood in Sultan Gazi on the European side. What were your impressions? And to be more specific, what do you think what have you observed that the voters think about the Supreme Election Board's decision to annul the elections and to do a redo? What does the AKP's voter base think about this development?
Basically, especially in these neighborhoods that you have just mentioned, Akfırat and Malkoçoğlu districts, two different types of areas that we can just talk about. One, Akfırat is more of a rural area, a bit away from the city centers. It was a village just 3 years ago, and then the law changed, and then this kind of villages just added into the greater city borders. So it's now called a neighborhood instead of being called as villages. The number of people who live there is almost around 3,000, but the voters' numbers is 1,705. So when we look at the results of the latest elections, we see that in Akfırat, 3.6% of the people just voted for Ekrem İmamoğlu. This means Yıldırım just got 95.6 percent of the votes. This means with a very, I mean, the village itself just intensively voted for AKP, and we can say that easily when we look to those results. The village itself, the neighborhood itself, is very conservative. But even though when we were having a tour in Akfrat district, we visited there with my colleague Büşra Cebeci, we just noticed that even some of the most conservative people just get really very upset about the elections, the canceling the elections,
the decision by the
Supreme Election Board. So this made them a little bit frustrated. Not, I can say, totally they were just upset, but you know, some of them got really very frustrated with the election board's decision.
Did they comment on whether this would affect their decision on June 23rd?
Some of them, yeah. They said, you know, they are going to just vote for İmamoğlu instead of Binali Yıldırım this time, because, you know, they were just really felt upset, as I've said. But most of them, especially when we're talking about Akfrat region, I mean the one in the Anatolian side, the rural area, most of them are saying yes again for Binali Yıldırım, Mr. Binali Yıldırım. So this kind of a position is really very hard to say if İmamoğlu could do more there. You know, this is the one of the positions that we can see, and also the other part. I mean, Malkoçoğlu district is a very interesting indeed. Why? Because, you know, it's not a rural area; it's a urban area, but it's away from the city center itself. And the main thing is there, the neighborhood itself is also conservative. And as soon as I'm concerned, what I've seen in the district when we visited there, the Islamic groups are really very effective and powerful in both of those neighborhoods. When we look to the election results, again, Malkoçoğlu district just voted for İmamoğlu with 16.2%. But Yıldırım just got the 79.9, almost 80% of the votes. So this shows us another reality, especially when we look to the places which is away from the city center and working class and have a great percentage of immigration from the different parts of the country. They are getting more conservative and conservative every day and voting for AKP or who the candidate is of the ruling party. So the main thing, I guess, especially in Malkoçoğlu, I can just talk about Malkoçoğlu more than Akfrat because, you know, that was a very specific place. I mean, Akfrat, the rural area, it was a village and people were really very harshly conservative, very strictly conservative. But even in Malkoçoğlu, when we get to the European side, I saw that the people got really more frustrated or disappointed with the election results. I'll give you an example. We just tried to talk to the people in Malkoçoğlu district on the streets. We just asked one of the men who just was passing through if he could just answer our question about the electoral board's decision. So he said, you know, they are just calling me liars in my neighborhood, he said.
What was he referring to?
He was referring to, you know, they just, you know, he was a member of AKP. He has been just voting for AKP for almost 20 years. I mean, from the beginning of the party, from the establishment of the party. And he said, you know, this time I'm not going to give the votes because, you know, they are just pointing me out, saying that this man is voting for AKP, and this time we cannot just trust him. And he was just telling this with a very shaky voice. And eventually he said, you know, this time, no, I'm just gonna give them the last chance, and they just lost my trust to themselves, and they cannot attract my trust again back. This is also another thing.
So what we gather from your comments and observations is that there's, even though people, the AKP's voter base, even though they may still be voting for Binali Yıldırım, as we'll see how it turns out on June 23rd, we can say that there's an element of disappointment in their minds following the Supreme Election Board's decision. So let's turn to the base of Ekrem İmamoğlu now. You've been following his rallies lately after... when did the rallies start? Were they before the holidays or?
Right after the holiday, I mean, Ramadan holiday, they began rallying intensively, more intensively. So we can just say that, you know, especially after the holiday, people are getting really very crowded in the neighborhoods when he comes.
That's exactly what I was actually meaning to ask you. So what have you seen in the rallies? How is İmamoğlu's interaction with the crowds? Is he able to gather large crowds, or let's say larger crowds than he used to before March 31st? How's his performance generally?
That's a very interesting situation indeed. If I just come to the places where I visited with Ekrem İmamoğlu this time. Yesterday we've been to Bağcılar and Esenler, two intensively again conservative parts of Istanbul. We can say that in the very beginning of the election process in in the very beginning of the process, they were just saying that, you know, they definitely are going to vote for AKP again because, you know, they are ruling the country for almost 20 years. So if they are conservative, that's the only option for them to vote for Recep Tayyip Erdogan's party. But this time, they are, I guess, as soon as I'm concerned, and according to my observations, are just voting. Some of them change their minds, and they tend to vote for İmamoğlu. I don't know what the percentage is or how the difference for votes are going to play a role in that process, but I can say some of them especially are going to vote for him. And I can easily say another thing, that Ekrem İmamoğlu could attract more crowds on the in the rallies, especially for the last 2 weeks. I can see that. You've seen Esenyurt, you know, Esenyurt was also another part where also the Kurdish population is having a high effect on the political facts of Turkey or Istanbul. We can say they're getting more and more crowded every day. And Bağcılar just surprised me because, you know, Bağcılar is, you know, tend to give most of the votes to the ruling party, AKP, but this time I saw an extraordinary crowd when we just compare the previous rallies. And also Esenler. Esenler is one of the other important place. Why it's important? Because the mayor of Esenler just, you know, implied that Trabzon and Black Sea thing. You remember that, you know, that discussion, the Pontic connection. So that was the place where that mayor is ruling at the moment. So what we saw there was very interesting, which is they were playing I mean, CHP stand. They just made the music, and all the music were Black Sea folkloric music. We can see, we can just hear all that Black Sea coast songs. So they were trying to give another message to the people who are ruling at the moment, the small part of small district of this city. So this was interesting, and also there were a lot of people just gathered in the square where they just hold rally. So that was seeing things changing a little bit, but we cannot, of course, say exactly how many votes are going to go for İmamoğlu or Yıldırım, but things can change a little.
Thank you very much, Murat.
You are
Let's
welcome.
see what happens after Sunday's debate. It's also another much awaited event before the June 23rd redo vote. Thanks again, Murat. We'll continue
Thank you
with
very much.
our next news video now. Turkey hit back at a U.S. ultimatum this week over Turkey's plan to buy the Russian S-400 air defense systems on Thursday, warning that such moves were not in the spirit of the alliance between the two NATO member states.
Defense Minister Hulusi Akar used a telephone call with his American counterpart, Patrick Shanahan, to protest at a deadline imposed by the acting U.S. Defense Secretary in a letter last week. Later, Turkey's presidential spokesman Ibrahim Kalın said he had spoken with John Bolton, U.S. President Donald Trump's national security advisor, to convey the same message. The coordinated pushback came after President Recep Tayyip Erdogan struck a defiant tone in the face of mounting warnings over Ankara's apparent determination to go ahead with the purchase of the Russian military technology. Addressing the subject for the first time since Mr. Shanahan's letter, President Erdogan declared that the agreement with Moscow was a done deal. "I'm not saying we will buy S-400s. We have already bought them," he told members of his ruling party. "It's a done deal. Hopefully these systems will be delivered to our country next month." According to the analysts, if the S-400 system arrives in Turkey, it will not only trigger sanctions that could inflict severe pain on Turkey's fragile economy, but will also plunge Ankara's relationship with its NATO allies into its greatest crisis in decades. If the purchase goes ahead, the US Congress is expected to instruct Trump to impose sanctions under legislation aimed at stymieing the Russian defense sector, a scenario that investors fear could trigger a repeat of last summer's Turkish currency crisis. At the same time, the Pentagon has told Turkey that it will be removed from the F-35 program if it proceeds with the deal. In his letter last week, Shanahan said that the US would begin unwinding the country's role in manufacturing the F-35 if it did not cancel its S-400 order by July 31st, and would also halt Turkey's acquisition of the jets. Yet on Wednesday, President Erdogan showed no sign of backing down in the face of that warning. He said that Turkey was not just a customer, but a production partner on the jet, and said that he hoped to discuss the issue with US President Donald Trump at the G20 summit in Japan later this month.
Joining us now is Professor Serhat Güvenç from Kadir Has University's Department of International Relations, and he will be answering our questions on the latest developments in Turkey's ongoing crisis with the U.S. over Turkey's purchase of the S-400, the Russian S-400 air defense systems. Good evening, Professor Güvenç. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. So as we've just heard in our news video, Turkey's Defense Minister Hulusi Akar had a telephone call with his American counterpart this week, Patrick Shanahan, and Akar protested at the deadline imposed by the US on Turkey last week. So how do you evaluate this fresh development within the scope of this ongoing crisis?
I think President Erdogan had already mentioned the possibility that they would be contacting their counterparts on the other side of the Atlantic regarding this deadline set for Turkey to decide whether it would get S-400s or not. Therefore, that conversation, phone call, did not surprise me at all because it was in the works, as we were told by the president. And also it is a significant step or a measure in terms of managing the current crisis between Turkey and the United States. What makes this phone conversation more interesting is that instead of replying, sending a reply with a harshly worded letter to his U.S. counterpart, Turkish Defense Minister preferred to have a conversation. In other words, he preferred to rely on verbal means than written means. And also I see that as an indication on the part of Turkey to contain the issue so that it does not go to the level of a brink or a rupture in the relations between the two countries. However, the situation is serious. There is a definite deadline, and it seems that both sides dug their heels in their respective positions.
Professor Güvenç, as you know, Turkey will hold a very critical election in less than 10 days, although this specific election will only be for the mayor, for electing the mayor of Istanbul. It's still critical, and how would you locate these elections within the scope of this crisis?
Well, compared to previous instances of crisis with the United States, I think the domestic politics dimension this time is much less significant because, as you already point out, it's only local elections that will take place only in a city. Therefore, the voters, I don't think, are paying sufficient or paying significant attention to the issue around S-400s. And it seems that indeed the public in Turkey in general began to finally realize what was happening around the two arms deals, one with Russia and the United States. So I don't see a direct connection. However, for President Erdogan and his ruling coalition, I guess, taking a back step on the deal on the eve of such an election might be considered too risky. Therefore, I'm not totally of the opinion that the whole issue has a strong connection with the elections, the repeated municipal elections in Istanbul, but I cannot deny altogether that there is no connection, at least in the minds of the ruling coalition in Turkey, between the two issues. So they are somehow related, but the link is not as strong as was the case with the release of the U.S. pastor Branson, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Finally, Professor Güvenç, what's your prediction for the near future? Will a solution be reached between Turkey and U.S. for this crisis?
Well, there doesn't seem to be a midway between the two positions. I mean, the two sides are located on two extremes of the decision spectrum. United States is adamant that the moment those S-400s cross Turkish borders, Turkey will be kicked out of the F-35 program, and they already put some measures to that effect. Whereas Turkey refuses to see a linkage between the two arms deals and is not anywhere close to accept that S-400 and F-35 are mutually exclusive options. Well, I'm afraid I'm not very optimistic about the outcome of this standoff between Turkey and the United States. We may see at the end of the issue that Turkey is moving away from the Western alliance as a result of this deal, because although Washington, or Pentagon to be precise, emphasized that they would continue to work with Turkey on other issues, but kicking a key ally from such a program will mean that the trust between the two sides have been lost, and therefore it will be very difficult for them to build consensus or agreement on other issues of security and strategic consensus indeed. Therefore, we may see a serious rupture in Turkish-US relations, and by extension, a questioning of Turkey's place as a member of NATO. That's my prediction, because I see no signs of change on either side, and many people have been talking about a train crash. Unless there is another crossroads ahead, or there is an emergency break, we may see that Turkey and United States find themselves on the verge of a very serious decision, make or break decision about whether they will remain connected as allies or strategic partners, or they will part company and will be placed in different parts or different sides of the emerging strategic configuration.
Thank you very much, Professor Güvenç, for your comments and for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
This week, we were joined by Professor Serhat Güvenç from Kadir Has University, and he commented on the latest developments in Turkey's ongoing crisis with the US over Turkey's purchase of the Russian S-400s. And now we'll continue with our next news video. Turkey's winning streak in its Euro 2020 qualification campaign ended on Tuesday when it lost 2-1 against Iceland in Reykjavik after beating world champion France 2-0 in Saturday night in Konya.
Defender Ragnar Sigurdsson gave Iceland the lead in the 21st minute with a header from close range following a corner, and struck again 11 minutes later, again heading home following a well-worked corner routine. Turkey responded with a headed goal of its own from a corner by Dorukhan Toköz shortly before halftime, but could not find an equalizer and saw its perfect start to qualifying halted. The game took place amid tensions between the two nations after Turkey complained of being made to wait for 3 hours at passport control a day earlier at Keflavik airport and being subjected to bag searches. Turkey issued a diplomatic note to condemn the mistreatment of Turkish footballers at the airport. The Turkish national football team's coach, Şenol Güneş, did not answer questions about the team's treatment at the airport after the game, but blamed his side's performance on fatigue. Turkey has 9 points in 4 matches in Group H of the Euro 2020 qualifiers and sits in the second spot on same points with leader France and third-placed Iceland.
The Justice Duty meeting of the families of the Çorlu train crash victims were met by police intervention outside the Constitutional Court building in Ankara this week.
The first hearing of the case on the train crash that happened in Çorlu on July 8th last year will be held in the Çorlu First Heavy Penal Court on July 3rd. The families of those that lost their lives in the accident gathered outside a park near the Constitutional Court in Ankara on Wednesday to release a public statement. The families and several members of the Turkish parliament that supported them, however, were met by police intervention. Mısra Özsel, the mother of Oğuz Ardasel, a 9-year-old victim of the train crash, protested the police intervention and said, "I want to call out to those murderers who need to hear me. We are here for the justice struggle of our children and parents. I don't want to make a statement here in a park where children are present. When those children see my child's photo, they call him a friend." The police prevented the families from making public statements, and one person fainted during the police intervention.
The mayor of Mudanya, a coastline district of Bursa, drew criticism after he instructed the municipal police to clear tents set up by Syrians along the coastline. Now we'll hear our reporter Murat Utku explain what went on in Mudanya.
Mudanya is one of the cities in South Marmara region, Turkey. This county belongs to the metropolitan city of Bursa, where the mayor Hayri Türk Yılmaz is a member of the Social Democrat main opposition party CHP, who tweeted posts from his own account saying some words which sounded racist according to those who are supporting the refugee rights. Mayor Türk Yılmaz ordered the Syrian refugees to be evacuated from where they have set their camps to spend the summer. There is a park alongside the coastline where beaches as well as recreation areas are set. Furthermore, a picture taken shows that the refugees also brought their animals along with them, even a camel. Municipality here evacuated those Syrian refugees with all the tents, their daily goods for living, as well as animals. But remarks expressed by the mayor through Twitter put him in a hard position so that he had to explain himself with the words he typed with a news conference. As Medyascope, we traveled to Mudanya with one of my colleagues and asked Mayor Türk Yılmaz about the words he said, and he explained himself about the words he wrote.
Müthiş bir rahatsızlık yaratmaya başladılar. They created a huge inconvenience. They behaved wrongly, especially for our own people, to live and spend their times properly, either in the city or on the coastline, where our people cannot make sports in those particular areas, cannot freely swim in the sea or tan because of their moral acts, their way of clothing, the tents they set in the park. Everywhere was invaded.
He defended himself as he didn't say, or he didn't even insist to say any words which could be considered as racist. His intention was to force anyone, including Syrians, to obey the rules of the city. It is impossible for anyone to come and set a camp in a recreation area like that. Also, the beaches has some rules. Anyone who obeys the rules could come and enjoy himself or herself by swimming and tanning. According to our observation, there are no longer Syrian refugees there, no camps, no animals. But the reaction to the tweets that accuses the mayor Türk Yılmaz still continues.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 9 p.m. Goodbye.